I didn't think anything was wrong at first. It wasn't unusual for Cindy to disappear for a while. She liked to walk, especially late at night, especially when things felt loud or crowded. That was how she handled stress. She would leave without much explanation and come back calmer, like she'd shaken something off. It was just who she was. It wasn't until the next morning, when her car was still parked exactly where she left it, that the feeling started to settle in. I met Cindy through mutual friends at Penn State. We weren't best friends, but we were close enough that I knew her patterns. She liked predictability more than she admitted. Same coffee order, same routes around campus, same small leather purse she carried everywhere. She never left her phone behind, not once. Even if she ran downstairs for 5 minutes, it went with her. Halloween weekend in State College was always chaos. Costumes, parties, strangers wandering the streets like they belonged there. Cindy went out that night. I didn't. I had an early shift the next morning and stayed home, half watching television, half listening to voices and music drifting in through my open window. I remember checking my phone around midnight. Nothing from her. That wasn't unusual. I went to bed around 1. The next morning, my phone was buzzing when I woke up. 3 missed calls, same number. I called back immediately. One of Cindy's friends answered, already sounding strained. She asked if I'd seen Cindy after the party. I said no. There was a pause that felt longer than it should have been. Then she said, Cindy never came home. At first, we all stayed calm. State College was safe. Cindy was responsible. She probably stayed at someone else's place. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she lost track of time. Those explanations floated around for most of the morning, and we held on to them because there wasn't anything else to hold. By early afternoon, the details started to feel wrong. Her car was still parked near her apartment, locked. Wallet inside, phone inside. That detail didn't hit me immediately. It took time to sink in. People don't leave their phone behind. Not her, not ever. Campus police got involved quickly. Flyers went up around town, bulletin boards filled with her face. Groups formed to search. I joined one that afternoon. We walked familiar paths first, then pushed outward toward quieter areas. We called her name, softly at first, louder as the hours passed, and just did beat. Nothing answered back. That first night after she vanished, I barely slept. I kept replaying the last time I'd seen her. The way she'd laughed at something stupid. The way she'd pulled her jacket tighter when the wind picked up. There was nothing in that memory that hinted at danger. Nothing that suggested it would be the last time. The next few days blurred together. The town changed. You could feel it. Conversations dropped in volume when her name came up. Halloween decorations disappeared faster than usual. People lingered at crosswalks, looking both ways longer than necessary. Every reported sighting gave us hope. Every dead end chipped away at it. Rothrock State Forest came up often. Cindy liked walking trails. She liked quiet places where no one expected conversation. It made sense. I didn't like that it made sense. I went out there once with a small group. We walked marked trails, then areas where the path softened and narrowed. The forest felt ordinary. Leaves underfoot, birds overhead, sunlight breaking through branches. It was hard to reconcile that calm with the idea that something terrible could happen there. But the deeper we walked, the quieter it felt. Not silent, just subdued, like the sound had been turned down slightly. As the days passed, I started noticing how often I checked my phone, how every unknown number made my stomach tighten. Nights were the worst, not because I expected answers, but because my mind wouldn't stop filling in the blanks. That was when the dreams began. They weren't dramatic, no images I could clearly describe, just the same feeling night after night. I'd be walking somewhere familiar and get the sense that someone was just ahead of me, close enough that I should be able to see them. I never did. I always woke up before anything happened. Weeks went by. Search efforts slowed. Classes resumed their rhythm. People stopped stopping at the flyers. Cindy's face faded into the background of campus life, still there, but easier to overlook. I tried to move on. Everyone did. But one evening, as winter settled in, I was walking home after dark. The air was cold and dry, the sidewalks nearly empty. I passed the spot where Cindy's car had been found. It was empty now, just another parking space. I stopped without realizing I had. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, slow, measured. I turned, expecting to see someone else heading home. No one was there. The sound didn't come back. I told myself it had been nothing, anxiety lingering longer than it should, but I stood there longer than necessary, listening, before forcing myself to keep walking. That night, I slept with the light on. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps. It felt insignificant compared to everything else. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing small things. Sounds that didn't quite fit, movements at the edge of my attention, the way certain places felt heavier than others. Time passed. Official updates became rare. Cindy's case was never closed, but it drifted into that quiet space where unanswered things tend to go. I left state college a year later. New job, new city. I told myself the distance would help. It didn't. Even now, years later, I still think about the way absence can change a place. How someone can leave behind routines, objects, habits, and no explanation. Some nights, when everything is quiet, I catch myself listening, not for answers, just for confirmation that nothing else has gone missing. After I left state college, I tried to keep my distance from the case, not in an intentional way. I just stopped looking for updates, stopped clicking links, stopped rereading old articles. I told myself it wasn't healthy to keep reopening something that never seemed to move forward. Life filled in the space instead. A new apartment, new coworkers, new routines that didn't involve walking past missing person flyers or scanning crowds for a familiar face. For a while, it worked. Then, a few years later, I went back for a weekend visit. It was early fall, the kind of weather that made state college feel almost gentle. I stayed with a friend near campus. The town looked mostly the same. A few new buildings, a few old ones gone. But the layout was familiar enough that my body remembered the routes before my mind did. On the second night, we went out for dinner, nothing fancy. Just a small place near College Avenue. We talked about work, about people we'd lost touch with. Cindy's name didn't come up. It rarely did anymore, unless someone deliberately brought it up. After dinner, I walked back alone. It was just after 10. The streets were quiet but not empty. A few groups passed by. Someone laughed too loudly somewhere down the block. The air smelled like damp leaves and cooling pavement. I wasn't thinking about Cindy until I reached the edge of campus. There was a stretch of sidewalk I used to walk often. It ran alongside a line of trees that separated the main path from a darker, less traveled area. I slowed without realizing it, my steps falling out of rhythm. That was when I noticed the sound. Footsteps. Behind me. They were steady, not hurried, not heavy. The kind of footsteps you don't notice right away because they don't demand attention. I told myself someone was just walking at the same pace. It happens. I kept walking. So did the footsteps. I crossed the street. They crossed too. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was listening. I waited until I reached a brighter area, then glanced back. The sidewalk behind me was empty. No one close enough to have made that sound. Bah! I stood there, pretending to check my phone, waiting for someone to pass so I could tell myself I'd imagined it. Eventually, I kept walking. That night, I dreamed about the forest. Not Rothrock exactly, just trees, tall ones, close together. The ground was uneven, and I kept adjusting my footing, careful not to trip. I knew I was following someone, though I never saw them. I just knew they were there, just ahead, close enough that if I moved faster, I might catch up. When I woke up, my heart was racing, but the fear faded quickly. Dreams are just dreams. Memory has a way of rearranging itself when you revisit places tied to unfinished things. I went home the next day and pushed it out of my mind. A few months later, I read an article about Cindy's case. It popped up unexpectedly, shared by someone I barely knew. There were no new developments, just a summary. The same details, the same unanswered questions. One line stood out. Someone had reported seeing a woman matching her description walking alone late at night near the edge of campus. The sighting had gone nowhere. I stared at that sentence longer than I needed to. After that, I started noticing how often I thought I heard someone walking near me when I was alone, in parking garages, on quiet streets, in my apartment hallway late at night. Every time I checked, there was no one there. It wasn't constant, it wasn't dramatic, it was just enough to make me pause, just enough to make me listen. I never told anyone about it. It didn't feel like something that needed to be said out loud. It felt personal, private, like something that would lose its shape if I tried to explain it. Years passed. Life moved on in the way it always does, unevenly, without regard for what gets left behind. Cindy's case stayed unresolved. Occasionally, her name would surface again, usually tied to an anniversary or a renewed appeal for information. Each time I read the article, felt the same quiet weight, and then closed the page. One evening, much later, I found myself walking alone again. Different town, different street, same hour. The air was cool. The neighborhood was quiet. I had my hands in my pockets, my mind drifting. I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there, not turning around, not moving forward. I waited longer than felt comfortable. When I finally looked back, the street was empty. I stood there until the silence settled back into place. I don't know what happened to Cindy. I don't know where she went or why no trace of her was ever found. I don't know if she walked into the forest or onto a street or into something none of us could see. I only know this. Some absences don't stay where they begin. They follow quietly. And sometimes, when everything else is still, they walk just a few steps behind you, close enough that you can hear them, but never close enough to catch. I don't walk alone at night anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what might happen, but because I'm not sure what might already be there. I grew up hearing the story before I understood what it meant. It was something adults mentioned in lowered voices, usually when they thought children weren't listening. I didn't know the names then. I only knew there had been a house not far from ours where something so wrong had happened that people still avoided talking about it decades later. In a town as small as ours, history didn't disappear. It settled into the background. It lived in side comments and unfinished sentences. It showed up in the way people hesitated when certain roads came up in conversation. The house sat outside town, past the last cluster of mailboxes where the pavement gave way to gravel. You could see it from the road, but only briefly, through a break in the trees. It looked ordinary. That was part of what made it uncomfortable. There was nothing about it that warned you to look away. My grandparents lived less than a mile from it. When I was a kid, I stayed with them often. Their house was warm, predictable, supper at the same time every night. The radio playing softly in the kitchen, my grandfather reading the paper at the table. Sometimes, when we drove past that stretch of road, my grandmother would fall quiet. My grandfather never did. He just kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the wheel. I asked about it once. I must have been 8 or 9. "What happened there?" I said, pointing through the window. My grandmother didn't answer. My grandfather cleared his throat and said, "That's not a place for children to worry about." That was the end of it. Years later, when I was old enough to piece things together, I learned what had happened. A family, 6 people, all dead in their home. The papers called it a murder-suicide. They focused on the man, his mental state, his eyes. Blue-eyed. All of them blue-eyed. The detail was repeated often, as if it mattered. Maybe it did. By the time I was in high school, the story had settled into legend. Not in a dramatic way, no ghosts, no screaming at night, just a quiet understanding that the place was wrong. Kids dared each other to drive past it after dark. No one ever stopped. I didn't think about it much until I moved back to town after college. My grandparents were gone by then. Their house had been sold. I rented a small place closer to the edge of town, closer than I realized at first. The road that led past the old house was the same one I took to get to work every morning. The first few times I passed it, I didn't notice anything unusual, just a building half hidden by trees. faded, still standing. Then one morning, as the days grew shorter, I noticed the curtains. They were open. That detail shouldn't have mattered. Plenty of empty houses have open curtains. Wind gets in, people forget, but this felt different. The windows were dark behind the glass, and the curtains were pulled back evenly, like someone had wanted the interior to be visible. I slowed down without meaning to. I didn't see anyone inside. The next day, the curtains were closed again. I told myself someone must be maintaining the property. That explanation fit easily enough. It allowed me to stop thinking about it. For a while, it worked. Then, one evening, I drove past after sunset. There was a light on upstairs, just one. Dim. Steady. I almost stopped the car. I didn't. The next morning, the house was dark again. I asked around casually. Neighbors. Co-workers. No one knew who owned the property now. Some thought it had been sold years ago. Others said it was tied up in paperwork. Everyone seemed slightly uncomfortable discussing it, even when nothing concrete was being said. That was when I started having trouble sleeping, not nightmares, just waking up suddenly with the sense that I had forgotten something important. I'd lie there, listening to the house settle, replaying the day in my head, trying to figure out what I'd missed. Once, during one of those nights, I found myself thinking about the blue-eyed six, about how all of them had been home, how none of them had left, how quiet it must have been afterward. I didn't like that my mind went there. A week later, I drove past the house again in the early morning fog. Visibility was poor, the trees blurred together. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at one of the upstairs windows, just a shape. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed out loud at myself. Lack of sleep does things to perception. I knew that. Still, I drove the rest of the way to work with the radio on louder than usual. That night, I dreamed about my grandparents' kitchen. Everything was exactly as it had been. The table, the chairs, the radio humming softly. The only thing that was wrong was the silence. No voices, no movement. Just the sense that I had arrived after something important had already happened. I woke up with the same feeling I'd had on those other nights, like I'd been too late. I started avoiding looking directly at the house when I drove past. It wasn't a conscious choice at first. I just realized one morning that my eyes slid away from it automatically, as if I'd trained myself without noticing. It didn't help. I still knew when the curtains changed. I still noticed when a light appeared where there hadn't been one before. I still felt that quiet pressure whenever I thought about what had happened there. The story wasn't something I believed in. It wasn't a ghost story. It was history, documented, explained, wrapped up neatly in old newspaper clippings. And yet, the longer I lived there, the harder it became to convince myself that everything connected to that house had stayed in the past. Because some nights, when the town was quiet and the road outside my place was empty, I found myself thinking I could hear voices. Not words, just the suggestion of sound, as if something was being remembered out loud. After that, I started taking a different route to work. It added 10 minutes to my drive, but it meant I didn't have to pass the house. I told myself it was about traffic, about road conditions, about convenience. But every morning when I turned away from that stretch of gravel, I felt a small, quiet sense of relief. That relief didn't last. The dreams became more specific, not violent, not graphic, just repetitive. I'd be standing in a hallway I didn't recognize, narrow and dimly lit, doors on either side, all of them closed. I knew, without knowing how, that the people inside those rooms weren't asleep. They were waiting. I always woke up before any door opened. During the day, things were mostly normal. Work, errands, small talk. But I caught myself listening more carefully to people's voices, noticing how sound carried in enclosed spaces. I noticed how often silence fell after someone stopped speaking, how heavy it could feel. One evening, I ran into an older man at the grocery store. He recognized my last name and asked if I was related to my grandparents. When I said yes, he nodded and smiled faintly. They lived near that old place, he said. I didn't ask which place. I knew. He didn't elaborate. He just picked up his bag and walked away, leaving the sentence unfinished. That stayed with me longer than it should have. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of a car slowing down outside my house. Headlights swept briefly across the ceiling. I lay still, listening as the engine idled for a moment, then cut off. A door opened, closed, footsteps on gravel. They stopped. I waited for them to continue toward the neighboring house. They didn't. After what felt like several minutes, the footsteps retreated. An engine started again. The car drove away. In the morning, there was nothing outside. No tire marks, no sign anyone had stopped. I told myself it was a delivery truck. Someone lost anything that fit. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I drove past the house. The curtains were open again. Every window on the front of the house was uncovered, exposing dark, empty rooms. I slowed down despite myself, scanning the interior as much as I could from the road. I didn't see movement. I didn't see furniture, just shadows. Then I noticed the upstairs window. Someone was standing there, not clearly, not in a way I could describe with confidence, just the sense of a figure where there hadn't been one before. Tall, still, watching. I looked away immediately. My heart was pounding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. When I forced myself to look back, the window was empty again. I didn't drive past that house again. But I didn't need to. The awareness followed me. At night, lying in bed, I found myself thinking about the details I'd learned over the years. How everyone in the house had been found where they'd gone to sleep. How there were no signs of struggle. How the papers mentioned the quiet. That detail came up again and again. Quiet. As if the absence of noise had been notable enough to record. I started leaving a light on in my living room at night. It wasn't about fear. It was about presence. About reminding myself that I was awake, that I existed, that the house around me was occupied. One night, close to winter, I woke up with that same sense of having arrived too late. I didn't hear anything at first. I just knew I was awake, fully awake. The house was still, too still. Then I heard it, a soft sound, not from outside, from inside the house, from the hallway. It wasn't footsteps exactly. More like someone standing and shifting their weight, a subtle creak of wood responding to pressure. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound didn't move closer. It didn't move away. It just stayed there, patient. I waited for it to stop. It didn't. After a while, I spoke. My voice sounded small in the quiet. "Hello?" The sound stopped immediately. The silence afterward felt deliberate. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't call out again. I lay there until morning, staring at the door, listening to my own breathing, trying not to imagine anyone standing on the other side. When the sun came up, the house felt normal again. Warm, familiar. I told myself it had been a half-dream, a misinterpretation. I moved out 2 months later. I told people I wanted a shorter commute, a change of scenery. No one questioned it. I don't live near that part of town anymore. I don't drive those roads. I don't ask about the house. But sometimes, when I visit family or pass through the area for work, I catch myself glancing toward the tree line, even when I know I can't see it from where I am. The story of the Blue-Eyed Six is considered finished, solved, filed away as something tragic but contained. I don't think that's entirely true. Some things don't stay where they happen. They linger. They wait for quiet moments, for familiar places, for people who remember. Every now and then, late at night, when the house is silent and the lights are off, I think I hear movement in the hallway. Just a subtle shift. A reminder. And in those moments, I understand why no one ever wanted to talk about that house. Not because of what happened there, but because of what never quite left. I didn't know Janette well. That's important. We weren't close friends. We didn't sit together at lunch or talk on the phone at night. She was just someone I recognized, someone I passed in the hallway often enough that her face became familiar in the way small-town faces do. That's part of what made it so unsettling later. How someone could be so present in the background of your life and then suddenly become the only thing anyone talked about. Springfield Township was quiet in the early 70s. quiet in a way that felt permanent. Same streets, same shops, same faces aging in place. I was still in high school then, still living at home, still assuming that whatever existed beyond our town wasn't something I'd have to deal with yet. Janette disappeared in the late summer. I remember the heat more than the date, thick, unmoving air. Windows open at night because no one had air conditioning, cicadas loud enough to drown out conversation. At first, it didn't register as a disappearance. People said she'd run away. Teenagers did that sometimes. Or she'd gone to stay with friends. That explanation floated around easily, passed from one adult to another like it didn't need much proof. I accepted it without thinking too hard. It wasn't until weeks later, when her face started appearing on flyers taped to telephone poles, that something shifted. The optimism faded. The conversations grew quieter. People stopped saying when she comes back and started saying if. I remember the day they found her body. I wasn't there. I heard about it the way most people did, through a chain of phone calls and hushed conversations. A hill, woods, a place no one had any reason to be. The details were vague at first, as if saying too much might make it worse. By the time the story settled into something more concrete, the damage was already done. They said she'd been there for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about that. About how close she'd been the whole time, about how many people must have walked past that hill without knowing. After that, nothing felt quite the same. School resumed like it always did, but the rhythm was off. Teachers avoided the subject. Students whispered anyway. Rumors moved faster than facts. There were stories about strange markings near where she'd been found, about objects arranged in ways that didn't make sense, about people who practiced things they weren't supposed to. I didn't know what to believe. What I did know was that my parents started paying closer attention to where I went, what time I came home, who I was with. Doors were locked earlier, windows stayed shut. One afternoon, not long after the funeral, I found myself walking home alone. It wasn't far, just a few blocks. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As I passed a stretch of trees near the edge of town, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Awareness. Not fear exactly, just the sense that the space around me had depth I hadn't noticed until then. Like there was more happening than I could see. I walked faster. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Still, I didn't slow down until I reached my street. That night, I dreamed about the hill. Not in detail. Just the feeling of standing somewhere elevated, looking down at the town, watching lights flicker on one by one as the sky darkened. I woke up with the image lingering, even though I'd never been there. I told myself it was just my mind processing things. That's what people said back then. That tragedy seeped into dreams because there was nowhere else for it to go. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing how often adults stopped talking when kids entered the room. How certain names were avoided, how the woods became something people gestured toward instead of naming directly. I overheard my mother on the phone one night, her voice low and tense. I caught fragments. They don't know. Evidence gone. It was handled wrong. She hung up when she noticed me listening. That was the first time I realized that whatever had happened to Janette wasn't going to be resolved quickly or cleanly. I didn't go near the hill. No one my age did, not officially, but people talked about it, about how it felt different now, about how birds didn't seem to linger there the way they used to. I didn't believe that part. I wanted explanations, logical ones. I wanted someone to tell us exactly what had happened and why. But instead, the story fractured. Different versions circulated, none of them lined up neatly. And beneath all of it was the same unsettling truth. Janette had vanished from an ordinary place and been found somewhere no one wanted to think about. That realization stayed with me, long after the headlines faded, long after the town tried to move on. After they found Janette, the town didn't grieve the way I expected it to. There were no loud expressions of sorrow, no public anger that lasted very long. Everything happened quietly. People lowered their voices. Parents tightened their rules. Life continued, but it did so carefully, like everyone was afraid of disturbing something that hadn't settled yet. The hill was fenced off for a while, not with anything substantial, just tape and a few signs that said to stay back. Most people obeyed. A few didn't. There were rumors about teenagers sneaking up there at night, daring each other to stand where she'd been found. I never did. I didn't want that image in my head any more than it already was. At school, her name came up less and less. Teachers discouraged discussion. Guidance counselors reminded us to focus on our studies. It was clear that the adults wanted things to return to normal as quickly as possible, but normal didn't fit anymore. I started paying attention to small things. The way certain adults stiffened when the woods were mentioned. The way some people crossed themselves when they passed that part of town. The way conversations stopped mid-sentence if someone walked by unexpectedly. One afternoon, I overheard two women talking in the grocery store. They were standing near the produce section, leaning close to each other. "They moved things," one of them said. "Before the police?" the other asked. There was a pause, then a quiet yes. They noticed me standing nearby and went silent. One of them gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't know what they meant exactly, but I understood enough to feel uneasy. Later, I asked my mother about it. She didn't answer right away. She kept washing dishes, her back to me, the sound of running water filling the kitchen. "Some things aren't meant to be speculated about," she finally said. That was as close as I got to an explanation. As summer turned into fall, the hill faded from daily conversation, but it never quite left our collective awareness. It became one of those places people referenced indirectly. You know where. That area, up there. One evening, I was driving home later than usual. It had rained earlier, and the roads were slick, reflecting the glow of streetlights. I took a route I didn't normally use, cutting through the edge of town to save a few minutes. The road curved gently as it approached the wooded area near the hill. I slowed down. I didn't see anything unusual. No figures, no lights, just trees and shadow and wet pavement. Still, I felt that same awareness I'd felt months earlier. Like the space around me had weight. I rolled down my window slightly. The air was still. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. It was too quiet. I drove on, my hands tight on the steering wheel, not fully relaxing until the houses came back into view. That night, I dreamed again. This time, I was walking uphill. The ground was uneven, and I had to watch my footing. I could hear voices behind me, but they were indistinct, blending together into a low murmur. I knew they were talking about something important, something I wasn't supposed to hear. When I reached the top, there was nothing there. Just the town below, lights scattered like they always were. I woke up before dawn, my heart racing, the dream clinging to me longer than usual. Years passed. I graduated. I left town. I built a life somewhere else. From a distance, Springfield Township became just another place on a map, a point in my past that didn't require much attention. But Janette never completely left my thoughts. Every few years, her case resurfaced. Someone would write an article. Someone would ask questions again. Each time, the same themes appeared: mishandled evidence, missing records, leads that went nowhere. No answers. I went back to visit my parents one summer, long after I'd moved away. They were older then, slower. The town had changed in small ways, but remained mostly the same. One afternoon, I went for a drive by myself. I didn't plan to go near the hill. I just found myself heading in that direction, following roads I knew by muscle memory. When I realized where I was, it felt too late to turn around without drawing attention to myself, even though no one else was around. The road was empty. The trees looked taller than I remembered. Way! I parked at a small pull-off and sat there for a long moment, the engine idling. I didn't get out. I didn't need to. Just being there felt like crossing a line. I looked toward the trees. I didn't see anything, but I had the overwhelming sense that the place was aware of me. Not in a dramatic way, just a quiet recognition, like something old being reminded that it was still remembered. I left after a few minutes, my chest tight in a way I couldn't explain. That was the last time I went there. Janette's death was never resolved. Officially, it remains unsolved. Depending on who you ask, it was an accident, a crime, something darker, or a combination of things no one wants to fully acknowledge. I don't know which explanation is closest to the truth. What I do know is this: some places absorb what happens in them. They don't advertise it. They don't demand attention. They just hold on to it quietly, shaping the way people move around them, the way conversations trail off, the way memories linger longer than they should. Even now, decades later, I still think about that hill, about how it looked like nothing special, about how close it was to everything, and about how easy it was, in the end, for the town to look away. The morning started like every other morning. That's the part that stays with me. How ordinary it was. How nothing about it hinted at what the day would become. I lived a few miles outside Nickelmines then, close enough that the rhythms of the Amish community blended naturally into everyday life. Horse-drawn buggies on the road, children walking in small groups, the sound of church bells on certain days. It was quiet, but not empty. Predictable, steady. I worked from home at the time. That morning, I remember making coffee and standing at the kitchen window, watching the fog lift slowly from the fields. The air was cool, the sky was pale, everything felt settled. Sometime mid-morning, I noticed that the road was quieter than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. Traffic fluctuated. Some days the buggies came earlier. Some days later, I went back to my work and lost track of time. It wasn't until I heard sirens that I stopped what I was doing. Sirens weren't common out there. Not like that. Not like that. One or two might pass through on their way to somewhere else, but this was different. The sound didn't fade. It grew louder, then another joined it, then another. I stepped outside. Down the road, vehicles were moving faster than they ever did out there. A police car, then an ambulance, then another. All heading in the same direction. Toward the schoolhouse. I didn't know why that detail landed so heavily at the time. I just remember thinking how strange it was to see emergency vehicles heading toward a place that was usually so still. Within minutes, my phone rang. It was a neighbor. She didn't explain, she just asked if I'd heard anything. Her voice was tight, like she was holding it together by force. I said no. She said something had happened at the school. That was all. I hung up and stood there, the phone still in my hand, listening to the sirens echo across the fields. The sound carried farther than it should have. It seemed to stretch, bending around barns and trees, refusing to dissipate. I didn't drive over. No one I knew did. It felt wrong to go closer. We stayed where we were and waited for information to come to us. It came slowly, fragmented. Someone said there was a man inside. Someone said children were hurt. Someone said not to speculate. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the wood grain, trying to make sense of the words as they came in. None of them fit together properly. By early afternoon, the road was closed off. News vans appeared where they didn't belong. People gathered at the edges of their properties, watching quietly. No one spoke loudly. No one cried openly. The silence felt deliberate. I found out later that some of the parents had been nearby when it happened. Close enough to hear something was wrong, but not close enough to do anything about it. That detail lodged itself in my mind and never really left. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Updates came through the radio, through whispered conversations, through looks exchanged between people who didn't know what to say to each other. Children had been killed. That sentence didn't make sense then. It still doesn't, not fully. It felt like language breaking down, like words being asked to carry more than they were built for. That night, the town went dark early. Lights off, curtains drawn. Even the usual evening sounds were muted. No buggies, no distant laughter, just stillness. I slept poorly. Every time I drifted off, I woke again, my mind replaying the same unanswered questions. How something like that could happen there. How anyone could bring that kind of violence into a place built on trust. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond Nickelmines. Reporters came from everywhere. Cameras pointed toward places that had never been photographed before. The schoolhouse became something else entirely. A symbol, a headline. But for those of us who lived nearby, it was something more immediate. The road stayed closed for a long time. When it finally reopened, traffic moved slower than before. People avoided looking toward the building even after it was gone. I drove past the area once, weeks later, just once. The schoolhouse wasn't there anymore. The ground had been cleared. The space felt too open, like something had been removed too thoroughly. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. What stayed with me wasn't the images from the news or the details everyone debated later. It was the way the quiet changed after that day, the way it settled heavier than before, the way it felt less like peace and more like restraint, as if the town was holding its breath. In the weeks after, people spoke less and listened more. That was the biggest change. Conversations slowed. Questions went unanswered. When someone did speak, it was usually about something practical: weather, crops, schedules, anything that didn't touch the center of what had happened. It felt like the town had collectively decided to move around the event rather than through it. The families grieved quietly. That wasn't unusual in the Amish community, but this quiet felt different, more deliberate, more guarded. Outsiders mistook it for strength. Those of us nearby understood it as survival. I attended a small gathering a few days after the incident. Not a vigil exactly, just neighbors standing together in a barn, offering food, offering presents. No speeches, no prayers spoken out loud. Just the sound of people breathing in the same space. At one point, a woman near me began to cry softly. No one turned to look. Two others moved closer to her without a word. That was how everything happened. Then, small, contained, careful. At night, I started waking up more often. Not from nightmares, just waking, fully alert, the house quiet in a way it hadn't been before. I'd lie there, listening to the absence of sound, thinking about how many mornings had started exactly the same way that one had. How nothing in the air had warned anyone. I began to notice how easily routine can be mistaken for safety. The news cycle moved on faster than I expected. Other stories replaced ours. The schoolhouse was dismantled. The land returned to the family. Life from the outside appeared to resume. But there were gaps. Children took different routes when they walked. Adults lingered longer at the ends of driveways. Doors were still unlocked, but people checked them anyway. Trust remained, but it was thinner, stretched over something fragile. I drove past the area more often than I needed to, not out of morbid curiosity, more like checking a wound to see if it was still there. Nothing marked the spot. That was intentional. Still, every time I passed, I felt it, a quiet pressure, a sense of being somewhere that had been changed without visible evidence. The fields looked the same. The sky moved the same way over them. But the space held memory. One evening, months later, I was walking outside just after sunset. The air was cool, the light fading. I could hear distant voices carrying across the fields, children playing somewhere far off. For a moment, everything felt almost normal again. Then the sound stopped, not gradually, all at once. I stood there, listening. No wind, no voices, no insects, just stillness. I felt the same awareness I'd felt that first afternoon when the sirens passed, like the land itself was holding something back. The sound returned after a few seconds. A breeze. A door closing somewhere. Life continuing. I went inside and locked the door without thinking about it. Over time, I realized I had started measuring my days differently. Not by hours or tasks, but by how close I felt to that quiet. Some days it stayed at a distance. Other days it pressed in, making even ordinary moments feel tentative. I thought about the parents often, about how they must wake up every morning and move forward because there was no alternative. About how forgiveness was offered publicly, discussed widely, and misunderstood by most people who talked about it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean the space where it happened became neutral again. Years later, after I'd moved away, I returned for a visit. The town looked much the same, new buildings in places, old ones gone, the roads familiar. I drove past the area where the schoolhouse had been. I slowed down, even though there was nothing to see. I felt it anyway. That same quiet weight, that same sense of absence layered over routine. I didn't stop. I kept driving. Some events don't announce themselves with warning signs. They don't arrive with noise or spectacle. They slip into ordinary days and fracture them quietly, leaving everything else intact enough that people expect it to fit back together. But it never quite does. Even now, when I think about that morning, I don't remember panic or fear. I remember coffee cooling in my mug. Fog lifting off the fields, the sound of sirens bending across familiar land, and the realization, slow and unwelcome, that safety isn't something a place guarantees. It's something people believe in until they can't. I was in the library that day because it was quiet. That sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was just a habit. Late afternoons were the best after the lunch crowd thinned out before the evening rush started. The stacks were predictable. The lighting never changed. You could sit for hours and feel like nothing around you was moving. I was a graduate student then. Not in Betsy's department, but close enough that our paths crossed now and again. We didn't talk much. We recognized each other. That was it. A kind of familiarity that doesn't demand attention until it's suddenly gone. That afternoon, I arrived a little after 4. I remember checking my watch because I was running behind. I took the same route I always did, past the circulation desk, down the wide aisle, and into the stacks. The air smelled like paper and dust, and something faintly chemical from the cleaning solution they used on the floors. Everything felt normal. Too normal, in retrospect. I was halfway through an aisle when I noticed how quiet it was. Libraries are always quiet, but this was different. No coughing, no pages turning, no footsteps echoing between shelves. It felt like the space had emptied without me noticing. I sat down at one of the study tables near the end of the row. I'd been there maybe 10 minutes when I heard a sound I didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't loud. It was a short, sharp intake of breath, like someone had been startled or hurt, but trying not to draw attention. I looked up. A woman stood at the end of the aisle, partially obscured by the shelves. She was holding a book against her chest. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. I remember thinking she looked pale, but the lighting in that part of the library always made people look washed out. She didn't speak. She took a step forward, then another, as if she wasn't sure her legs were going to cooperate. For a moment, I wondered if she was going to ask for help. I opened my mouth to say something. She collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. No scream, no noise beyond the dull sound of her body hitting the floor. Books slid from her arms and scattered across the aisle. For a second, I just stared. My mind tried to make it into something manageable, a fainting spell, low blood sugar, stress. Anything but what it would later become. I stood up and walked toward her. That was when I saw the blood. Not a lot. That's what confused me. Just a dark spot spreading slowly on the back of her sweater. It didn't look real. It looked like something that belonged in a different context, somewhere louder, more obvious. I knelt beside her and called out, my voice too loud in the silence. She didn't respond. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one else had noticed, that no one else was there. We were in the middle of a public library in the middle of the day. I ran for help. When I came back with staff, the aisle filled quickly. People spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Someone told me to sit down. Someone else asked me what I'd seen. I tried to answer, but my thoughts kept snagging on the same detail. There had been no one else in the aisle. The ambulance arrived faster than I expected. Sirens outside, doors opening and closing. The quiet of the stacks replaced by controlled urgency. I didn't know her name then. I found out later, Betsy Ardsma. They told us she'd been stabbed just once, a single wound. That detail came up again and again, as if repetition might make it easier to understand. One stab, no struggle, no screams, no witnesses, in a place filled with people. I went home early that day. I don't remember the walk back. I only remember standing in my apartment, hands shaking, trying to replay the moments before she fell. The sound she made, the way she held the book, the empty aisle behind her. That night, I lay awake thinking about how close everything had been. How many people must have passed through that space without realizing what had just happened. The next morning, the library reopened. I didn't go back. I didn't go back to the library for weeks. At first, I told myself it was because I was busy. End-of-term deadlines, papers piling up. It wasn't unusual to study at home for a while. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't stop seeing that aisle, the way it looked before anything happened, the way it looked afterward. When I did return, it was early in the morning, before most people arrived. I told myself I just needed to prove something to myself, that the space was still just a space. Shelves, tables, lights. It wasn't. The aisle where Betsy collapsed had been cleaned thoroughly. You wouldn't have known anything had happened there if you hadn't known. Still, I found myself avoiding it, taking longer routes through the stacks without realizing I was doing it. People talked about the murder in fragments, in hallways, over coffee, never for long. There were rumors about suspects, about a man seen nearby, about arguments overheard elsewhere in the building. None of it settled into anything solid. The most disturbing part was how ordinary everything sounded. A woman stabbed once, in a library, in the middle of the day. That should have been impossible. Campus police asked to speak with me more than once. Each time they asked the same questions, just slightly rearranged. Had I noticed anyone else in the aisle? Had I heard footsteps, voices, anything out of place? I told them the truth. There had been nothing. That answer never seemed to satisfy them. They asked about the sound I'd heard. The sharp breath. I described it the same way every time. Short, controlled, like someone trying not to be noticed. One officer wrote it down carefully, nodding as if it meant something specific to him. I don't know if it did. Classes continued. Exams came and went. Betsy's name faded from conversation more quickly than I expected. Not because people didn't care, but because there was nothing new to say. No progress, no arrest, no explanation. The library remained open. That fact bothered me more than it should have. I started noticing how many people studied alone, how often someone would sit down nearby without speaking, how easily footsteps blended into the background. The place I'd once considered safe began to feel exposed in a way I couldn't articulate. One evening, I stayed late, working on a paper I couldn't afford to fall behind on. The building emptied gradually. Chairs scraped softly as people packed up. Doors closed in the distance. I realized I was alone only when I looked up and didn't see anyone else. The quiet pressed in. I packed my things quickly and left, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. When I reached the exit, I felt relief that surprised me with its intensity. After that, I stopped staying late. Years passed. I graduated. I moved away. Life filled itself with new routines, new spaces that felt neutral and unburdened. For the most part, the memory receded into something manageable. Then, one afternoon, I read an article about the case. It had been decades. There were still no answers. The headline used words like mystery and unsolved, but the article itself offered nothing new. Same details, same questions, same absence. What stayed with me was a single sentence buried near the end. Investigators believe the attacker may have blended in easily with the environment. I closed the article and sat there for a long time. Blended in. I thought about the way the library had felt that day. How nothing had stood out. How everything had seemed exactly as it should have been. I thought about how close I'd been. How easily I might have missed the sound if I'd been wearing headphones. How easily I might have kept my head down and never looked up at all. I went back to visit the campus once, years later. Just passing through. Curiosity more than anything. The library looked the same from the outside. Inside, some things had changed. New furniture, updated lighting. But the layout was familiar enough that my body remembered it. I didn't go into the stacks. I stood near the entrance for a while, watching people come and go, students laughing quietly. Someone arguing in a whisper. A couple studying side by side, heads bent together. Everything looked normal. That was the problem. Before I left, I walked partway down one of the aisles. Not the same one, just close enough to feel the familiar narrowing of space, the way sound softened and sharpened at the same time. I stopped and listened. Nothing unusual, just a hum of the building, the distant sound of movement, life continuing. As I turned to leave, I had a sudden, irrational thought. That whatever had happened to Betsy hadn't required secrecy or darkness or isolation. It had required only that no one expect it. I don't know who killed her. I don't know how they walked away without being seen. I don't know how something so violent fit so cleanly into such an ordinary moment. I only know that I think about her sometimes when I'm in public places that feel too quiet. Libraries, museums, long hallways where people move past each other without looking up. I listen more closely now, not because I expect to hear anything, but because I know how easily something can happen without announcing itself and how long its echo can last.